So now we've come to the end of the first general topic on the module of Tsarist and Communist Russia. What I'm going to do is go through an exam essay question. This is, I think, one from a past paper, and we're just going to look at, I've written a couple of things down, but I'm going to just hopefully do a little bit more writing and just explaining more than reading off what I've written out. So the essay is actually a really nice one. It would be very good if you had this in the exam. Whoever did get this in an exam, they're very lucky. So it simply says, the policies of Alexander III in the years 1881 to 1894 greatly weakened the Russian Empire. Assess the validity of this view. Well, all this is really asking you to do is to weigh up the pros and cons of Alexander's policies. So all it's asking is, let me just zoom in a little bit, there we go. All it's asking is the pros and cons of Alexander's policies. And so you should be thinking straight away, what were Alexander's policies? So you just rattle them off and just think about every single policy that he has that you can remember when you're in the exam. And you've got to think, right, which ones were good, which ones were bad, and then argue whether or not, in your opinion, generally, this greatly weakened the Russian Empire. Okay, so how you're going to structure the essay is something that is always asked whenever essay questions are asked. So I've done a series that should be uploaded by now on exactly how to write the essay questions, the source questions and the extract questions for AQA A-level history. But for now, we'll just talk about the sort of essay structure. It can be structured however you really want it to be structured. As long as it's a balanced essay and then it looks and it's neat and it's clean, it doesn't really matter. People tend to just go for the sort of the introduction, 3-paragraph conclusion. And that probably is the best way to do it. It's the easiest way to do it. But if you feel like you want to do 2 large paragraphs, maybe your paragraph on policies that didn't weaken Russia, and then policies that did weaken Russia, as long as they're really good and your introduction and conclusion are really good, then I don't see any reason why you can't do really well. Okay? And obviously the easiest way to structure this is to just argue for and against. And now, so that's really what it's asking you to do, for and against. We'll go into the details in a minute. But we can talk also about, the way we split the essay up can be in 2 real ways, effectively. Well, 3 actually, technically. If you wanted to do a huge paragraph on all the policies that weakened the Russian Empire, and you just have that there and argue exactly for why all that is, then go ahead, do that, and then you have an entire big paragraph on policies that didn't weaken. And then that's one way in which you can sort of structure it. Another way is to look at the specific policies. Well, what kind of policies are there that you can have? Well, you can talk about, for example, the economy, so economic policies. Okay. You can talk about more social policies. Okay. And then for a third one, you can maybe talk about religious policies. Or, if you didn't want to do religious policies, you could split the economic policies into industry, and agriculture. There's loads of ways. I'm spelling agriculture wrong. There are loads of ways in which you can sort of write this essay. So I would generally pick one of 2 ways. I'd either pick this way, where I look at, say, economic policies and weigh up whether or not they weaken Russia, then move on to social policies and whether or not they weaken Russia, and then maybe religious policies, or I talk about the peasants or agriculture or whatever. That's one way I would structure it. Another way I would structure it is by looking at the time scale, okay? So we can split this up because this is part of the breadth paper. This is a paper 1 question. So it's asking, so paper 1, if you read the specification, is asking about a development over a period of time, development in history over a period of time, specifically like 100 years or so. So if you structure the essay question in terms of the developments of policies over a period of time, then that could almost align with what the specification is asking. And it can also be, and if you know your history well enough, you know your historical context, it can be easier than doing it this way. So, for example, we have been given the timescale of 1881 to 1894. Okay, so we can't talk about anything outside of these brackets. Okay, and if we talk about something that's outside of these brackets, we have to explain why we're talking about something that's outside of these brackets. So if we want to talk about something from 1880, we'd have to argue that this thing that happened in 1880 influenced something that happened in 1881. So you have to, generally just stick to the time frame that you're given. Okay, but we can split this up. We can talk about a number of things. So we could say, let's have a look at firstly 1881. Oh, that's a terrible 1881 to 1885. Okay, that could be one paragraph, and you talk about everything that happened in that time period. You could talk about the economic policies, social policies, agriculture, industry, anything like serfdom, religion, anything. Okay, and then we maybe talk about for a second paragraph 1885. I'm doing so bad at these writing eights. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. 1885 to 1890. And again, talk about everything within that period, okay? So if you know your historical context really well, and you know your dates and your time and when everything happened, then you can easily talk about this kind of thing, okay? And then we can go for the final paragraph, 1890 to 1894. And again, we'll talk about everything that happened in that period of time. And this gives it more of a chronological feel. This gives your essay more of like a sort of a time scale. And you can also, if you want to, start to point out the sort of differences and the sort of developments and reforms and changes that are made throughout the period of time. So it's a very good way of structuring essay questions if you get the chance to do it. There are essay questions that fit this style better than this particular one. I'd argue probably that this style fits this question. There's no real one way of saying whether or not it does or it doesn't, but I just feel like it's asking about policies of Alexander in a time period. I would argue that we're going to talk about 3 areas of policy specifically, but there are other essay questions that we will go throughout this little series of videos where we can look at the time frame and we will look at how to do it. So with that being said, let's get a look at a couple of the things that we can sort of add into our essay. This is by no means all of them. This is just a very quick, just a note-taking session that I did looking through previous videos and what I could have put in to this essay. So, reasons to think that Alexander's policies did weaken the Russian Empire. Okay, so bear in mind we are underneath the surface. We are just being asked what are the pros and cons of Alexander's policies. However, you can't write that in the essay. You've got to write whether or not they weakened the Russian Empire. Okay, so we could talk about policies of Russification. This increased tension between Russians and non-Russians, especially Russians and non-Russian speakers. And then if you know your policies of Russification, you can talk about language and religion. But then again, you could also argue against that, and you could argue that these policies helped unify Russian speakers. Okay? Russian speakers. It's good that you can have a piece of evidence and you can interpret it in 2 different ways. You can interpret it as pros and cons, because effectively there's no one bad or good piece of evidence. There's a bit more of a grey area. They never tend to be just either really, really bad or really, really good. Okay, so you can, like this one here, it's generally seen that it did create tensions, which is a bad thing, but it did unify Russian speakers, which is a good thing. So something that is generally seen as pretty bad was that there was military suppression of those who opposed Russification. That would have created underground opposition. So underground opposition and resentment. Okay, so resenting the Tsar and his policies. However, like I said, again, you can argue against that and say there wasn't actually any opposition. It says this military suppression probably caused underground opposition, but there's no evidence of this. So there's no evidence of this. No evidence of this, which does imply that the military suppression, although technically bad, it worked. It actually did work in suppressing those who opposed Russification. Anti-Jewish pogroms definitely would have weakened the Russian Empire, since it was they basically attacked an entire race of people, a group of people. So we can definitely argue that that is a weakening of the Russian Empire. Okay, and there's more. You can talk about economic policies. You can talk about the agriculture. You can talk about the famine that killed 350,000 people, etc., etc. Okay, so we could also then have on the other side reasons to think that Alexander's policies did not weaken the Russian Empire. Well, whilst there was opposition, it was suppressed successfully. Okay, so we see that when I say over here there's no evidence of this, there wasn't much opposition. So I'm just going to draw a very wiggly line all the way over here. So there wasn't that much opposition, and any opposition that there was successfully suppressed. So any policies that we could argue that did weaken the Russian Empire didn't weaken it enough for it to break. Okay. Grain exports increased and cotton industry expanded, showing economic development. Again, that's something that's going to strengthen the Russian Empire. It would strengthen GDP. Strengthen GDP. And when you strengthen GDP, everyone is happy, basically, is my very, very basic understanding of macroeconomics. So, anyway, whilst conversion to Orthodoxy was encouraged, people were happy to convert. That's a general understanding. You think about it, 75,000 people in the Baltics, we'll say, converted. They happily converted. And you can also argue the sort of do a bit of a sort of a meta-analysis of the entire question and say that whilst all these things were happening, the Russian Empire didn't fall and it didn't fail. Okay, so under Alexander III, the Russian Empire was absolutely fine. So to suggest that his policies significantly weakened the Russian Empire, greatly weakened the Russian Empire, is you can say that if you want, but there's no evidence that the Russian Empire actually fell during this time. So you can really argue it from lots of different angles, okay, and really get into how you would answer this question. It's a very nice question to ask, to be fair, because it's doing is basically asking you. It's not talking specifically about any specific policies. If it was economic policies, then that would narrow down the sort of things you could talk about, which would make it a little bit more difficult. But it's just policies in general. So anything Alexander did, was it good or bad for the Russian Empire? So in the next series of videos, we're going to start looking at Nicholas II and then the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Russian Revolution. And then after that, we'll look at another exam question, possibly a source question. I'm not sure yet. We'll look at something. We'll look at something there, and we'll start to analyse after that the Soviet Union and all the way up to the year of 1964. So stay tuned for those videos, and I'll see you in the next one.